grew up on the south side of Chicago. My parents found a home on Hamilton Avenue, a street named for the presidential aide and founding father, whose current moniker is emblazoned across theater marquees that stretch from Broadway to Boston. I don't know why, but when I was about yay high, I considered myself to be from Arkansas too. Maybe that's because my late mother, Mary Catherine, was born and raised there. That means by default, I'm from Arkansas as well, even though I was born in Stuttgart, West Germany. As irony would have it, Stuttgart is also the name of the soil that can be found in certain places in Arkansas. Its ruddy coloring, almost a perfect match, not only to my father's skin, but also to his tan Oldsmobile Cutlass that we drove down south. Daddy drove that Cutlass so fast that when we hit the highway, we looked like bats straight out of hell. At least that's what I thought, but didn't dare say, out loud anyway. Because if I wanted to keep my tongue, I didn't do that. My mother had told me that little girls weren't supposed to put filthy words in their mouths, as she would pinch my nose and push a lollipop between my cheeks. I smiled at that memory as I slurped down warm apple juice and ate cold chicken that had decided to kind of switch places on their own volition in the bag that Mom had packed for us for our trip. My family was headed to Brinkley, Arkansas, a place I called Blinkley, Arkansas, because it was so small, if you blinked, you could actually miss it. We were going to see my mother's mother's mother, my great-grandmother, aka great-grand. I called her that because to me, she was everything great and grand, in both spirit and demeanor. She was also the person who taught me what I now know about the environment and climate change, mainly while scrubbing a fresh batch of chitterlings, or as we call it, chitlins. Great-grand wasn't a tall woman. She wasn't diminutive either. It just seemed as though her width and her height had been in a tight race, with the former just inching past the latter. She'd been born a breech baby, and I like to say she burst onto the scene feet first so that she could hit the ground running. Great-grand was the oldest daughter of a soft-spoken Indian woman the color of ground nutmeg and a charcoal-colored father whose tall frame and straight white teeth sparkled underneath a sun that his long limbs appeared to touch. Those were the ones who started the climate change train. And my great-grand picked up that baton and passed it down to her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren like me. Great-grand taught me about climate change long before it was a buzzword on the name on top of a bill waiting for a lawmaker to sign it. That was because great-grand knew how to listen to the whispers of the trees, something that she'd learned from her own mama. Great-grand heard when the trees pleaded not to be chopped down because their leaves could be put to good use, like assuring that the air remained safe and clean and that the ground didn't get hotter than one of her pepper pies. Speaking of pepper pies, I remember sitting out on her front porch, a pepper pie tucked neatly inside my stomach, when she stood up tall. Great-grand pointed out at a lanky pine tree that was kind of leaning to the side in her front yard and said, "Child, let me tell you something that I don't think I've ever said to you before. Did I ever tell you that them trees can smell themselves, child? They can smell what's going on around them, just like that pot of chitlins I got in there cooking on the stove." In other words, they got common sense. Then she shrieked of laughter hysterically and started stirring that pot. It wasn't until much later that I learned the technical terminology for the things that great-grand was teaching me about the environment. Terms like volatile, strategic or organic compounds, climate change. Great-grand knew these things about the climate and environment because it was stitched in her DNA, just like those cornrows that crisscrossed her scalp. Despite the fact that she hadn't received a formal education, she was sharper than a preacher's suit on Sunday morning, pre-saliva, post-salvation. She had been a good student and had made it to the 3rd grade until her papa had pulled her out to put her to work in the fields, which was the case for most women of her generation, especially those from the South. They focused on 2 things, home and earth. They built one and worked the other. Agriculture was the primary income for the South, and black women contributed their share, working just as hard in the fields as they had in their homes, loving on husbands, raising babies, and cooking chitlins, greens, and cornbread, just like great-grand. By the time I was 12, standing at the intersection of Barbie dolls and boys, great-grand showed me how to open my palms, lay them out flat, thumbs up, in order to tell when them trees was about to take a bath, because that thunderstorm that was coming was going to soak them real good. It was over steaming pots layered with so many collards and turnips and mustard greens that great-grand looked at me and passed me a plate that looked like the Leaning Tower of Pieces from all the juicy slabs of ham and chicken that spilled over on the sides. It was then that great-grand taught me about plants and how things like temperature and the amount of rainfall they receive affects how they survive. She explained how the lack of moisture could change soil and how changed soil impacts climate change. Great-grand knew her soil, as evidenced by worn hands and a slightly bent back, the gardening diplomas bestowed upon her after years of planting and cultivating the topsoil on her farm. She was aware of the need to nurture the earth well before reports like the EPA's climate change indicator, which dates back to the early 20th century. Great-grand was a woman who was one with nature. She communicated with the trees, licked her finger and held it up to the sky to tell the temperature, and she taught through stories over pots of collard greens and chitlins, something called climate change. Not as a climate change expert, as I also do not profess myself to be, but as someone guided by the soul, just like that soul food she cooked for her family and surrounded all of us with that love. It is for that reason that I understand, as great-grand did, take care of the earth so that the earth will take care of you. And that's an idea worth sharing.